Thank you very much. It's really nice to be here at the Uppsala Association of International Affairs. This is where my interest found a place in the topic which became my research topic, mainly South Asia and parts of Africa, where I have studied conflicts of various kinds and attempts to establish democracy with different outcomes. So it's great to be here, and it's great to see so many of you here tonight. A cold autumn night like this one. It's very encouraging to see that you made your way here, and I will try to give something back to you tonight, and I'll first make a presentation. And this is a kind of an overview of developments in India. The focus is there on India, what's happening with India's democracy, mainly that, and development. And I will relate, first I'll take a broad view on development, then I'll dive into the Kashmir case just briefly, and then we'll go up again and take a broad view again to try to understand what India is going through, because this is very, very important. Before I start though, I just want to say also that there will be time for questions afterwards. But if I'm saying something which sounds weird or incorrect, or if you just want to ask something along the way, you can do so. But otherwise, there will be time for questions in the end, okay? So, great to see you here. And the first question is, why would I talk about India tonight? Well, for several reasons, because India is changing. And some things are happening rapidly there too. There are many things which are happening and changing rapidly in the world today. We have had a decline of the level of democracy in the world. It has been declining for 13 years in a row now. And it's because of what's happening in Europe, in the United States, in South America, and of course large parts of Asia. And these big countries like China and India, they influence that development quite a lot. So first of all, the reason for looking at what's happening to the system of governance in India is of course because we want to know what's happening to the people living in India. What kind of system are they living under? What kind of changes are they going through and seeing when the rest of the world is going in a certain kind of direction, which I just mentioned? Then we want to know, how does this affect them? Are they going in another directions? Are things better or worse there, and so on? So the people of India first, of course. Another reason is the geostrategic one. And this is an illustration of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is being pursued by China. And as you can see, China is building a lot of roads, not only physical roads on the ground. It's building connection lines, avenues for communication, for interaction, economic corridors, maritime roads or fairways, and so on. And India has a special place here. It's in the middle of this, so we'll talk about this. And if India is going through changes because of its internal politics, then the outside conditions, of course, are very important to understand as well. India is a very interesting case. We've seen India going through so many crises throughout the decades since independence, and still it has managed to uphold a very impressive level of democracy. This is the gender-wise voter turnout in the parliament elections in the lower house for India, which is the closest thing to our parliament here. And as you can see, the participation rate has been very high all along since the 60s. This is unusually high voter participation rate. And you can see also how the gap between men and women has been closing in. So now you can see that it's almost the same voter participation rate among men and women in India. This is a very impressive result, and India has been the case which has been so exciting to go to for so many reasons, like this one. And this is from a demonstration very close to the Jantar Mantar. That is where the permanent protest area is in Delhi, where a lot of groups are sent to keep up their protests. There are so many protests and NGOs doing things in Delhi. They come there and they make their statements and so on. So they have now a special area where they set up their tents and everything like that, so you can just go there and watch protests 24/7. And this is a picture I took from a women's rights movement in Delhi. And this is fascinating because India's civil society has been strong in certain areas in a way which has helped India's democracy. So India has for a long time defied many of the odds that we see. Poor countries that have been under colonial rule and other rulers before that and so on. It defied many predictions in the 60s, 70s, especially from political scientists, saying that there's nothing to build a democracy on here. And still India did something which was extraordinary and which was caused a lot of problems for our theories on how you build democracies and how certain systems of governance evolve. India managed to divide Pakistan's fate, where you have these recurring coups and where you had for a long time more of an ethnic state as compared to India. India managed to fight starvation crisis. Literacy has been going up quite impressively lately. This is affecting, in particular, for example, women's control over reproduction. So the families are becoming smaller. There are fewer babies born, which is a sign of a healthy development, because then you don't have to rely on large families anymore. And if you don't have to do that, you can rely on other things. And it means that health is improving in many other things. Despite what you read in the news and so on, actually there's more ethnic peace than ethnic war in India, if you look over time. Democracy has been working for quite a while. Now for the last 25 years there has been quite significant economic progress as well. So you have a middle class which is growing rapidly. And regional parties, regions have become much more important. And pluralism has been seen for a long time as being a kind of strength of India. We have looked at India and tried to understand how do you actually make such a plural society work. Well, then you have researchers like Paul Brass, for example, who pointed out earlier that that's the strength of India. You can't just go in and create a dictatorship here because there's so much diversity. So you can't just have one ruler ruling this place like a dictator. And also, you have research showing that, in Europe, for example, we have states created in a top-down manner. In India, you have a state-nation which has been growing from the bottom up, so to speak. So accommodation and negotiations with the center has shaped India's federation in such a way that it's become more inclusive, more sensitive to regional needs and such things. And minorities have been, not without problems, but minorities have been quite safe over time, if you compare to other places at least. And this is also impressive. But there have been, and there are challenges, new challenges coming up. There is still poverty, and you have the growing distance between the rich and the poor. The divides are growing. And we know from studying democracies that it's very hard to uphold a democracy if these divides grow too far. We can't put an exact number on it, but we know that it's hard to sustain a democracy if you have great divides between the richest and the poor. There is corruption. You have a Congress I party, which used to carry the political establishment in India, which has a very different role today, which we will come back to, and I will illustrate what I mean with that. In the 70s, there was a break in the democratic development, which I will also illustrate soon. You had conflicts in Punjab, for example, and of course in Kashmir you have had political assassinations of its most important leaders. Is it today or yesterday, Mahatma Gandhi? Today, yes. Today. It is today. Yes. Mahatma Gandhi's birthday. 150 years. What an honor to be holding this lecture today. But you know also that Mahatma Gandhi was murdered right after independence by a former member of what we know today as being a part of the Hindu nationalist movement. So I'll come back to that as well. There has been war, in particular between India and Pakistan, but also between India and China. You have trouble in the northeast. You have the Naxalite movement in the center of India. And this thing is really important to keep your eyes on. The modernization process. The cities are growing, and people are walking out of the agricultural sector. And that happened here 150 years ago and more. That was a part of the modernization process, right? And that has happened in China for the last 20, 30 years in particular. The difference with India is that the manufacturing industry, which a lot of people in China went into when the agricultural sector modernized, and like the industries that we had here that were waiting for all these people who stopped being farmers, it's not the same thing in India. So there is something, I wouldn't say a crisis of unemployment, but you have a lot of people who are going out of the agricultural sector and they don't find new jobs and they move to the cities, which are growing rapidly. And there, the air is bad, but they're also running out of water. This is a very important thing, because when you run out of water, you will have conflicts right away. So the challenges are there, and on top of that, we have what is called the Hindutva movement. Hindutva. I'll explain a little bit what is meant by that. When I started doing my research in the late 1980s, actually, the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is in power today, they were not a very big party then. And this is Lal Krishnan Advani on the election trail. So I tagged along on the election trail for a while and tried to understand this movement. And it was hard to figure out what it was about. I was not sure what it was about. And then if you fast forward until 2014, then I took this picture. You would go to city after city and you would see crowds like this, teaming up or supporting Modi. Narendra Modi, who is the Prime Minister today. Mass meetings with so many people, hundreds of thousands of people going to these meetings. It is a wave which we see now, which is at a fantastic scale. And from one perspective, you would say that, well, this is good for democracy. People are being mobilized, they are engaged, and they are participating, right? But there are certain things here we need to talk about. And that has to do with this, what is the type of this Hindu nationalism? And you could say that there's not one nationalism. You have degrees, of course, to what extent it's inclusive or chauvinistic and things like that. There are different interpretations of this. But a common way to describe this movement is to use the term Sangh Parivar. It's like a family of associations. And there you have different organizations included in it. You have the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which is a bit like the brains of the party. It's the ideological brains of the party. They're formulating at a very high ideological level what should be pursued by the party, the BJP, which is in power now. And they have conflicts between them. They're not acting as a uniform thing all the time. There are conflicts. And then you have the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, which is like the cadre movement, where people are taught from a quite young age how to become a good citizen and a good part of this Hindutva movement. And then you have radical movements in the west of India, like the Shiv Sena, and even openly violent organizations like the Bajrang Dal, who are like the muscle of the party, you can describe it like that. And what are they doing together now? Well, it's said that they're creating a Hindu Rashtra, an ethnic state for India. And if you read other people besides me, like Amrita Basu, who writes very well about this in her latest book, The Violent Conjunctures in Democratic India, she says that in 2002, when there were riots in Gujarat, when between 1,000 and 2,000 Muslims lost their lives, it was like a perfect storm, she said. You would have at the center, you would have the BJP in power, you would have the same thing at the state level in Gujarat, and you would have the same party in power at the local level. And when you see an alignment like that, there is no one who can slam the brakes when the crowds go out and when the riot starts. And that is what happened in 2002. And Amrita Basu argues that, well, because the BJP is so dominant now, we will see more of this, these perfect storms, when you have this alignment at all levels of governance in the system. This is a dangerous situation, she argues. And we will examine this a little bit closer. We are going to look at what is happening to democracy in India now. And you will see a lot of graphs now, so bear with me. But it's good to use a comparative perspective. I'm a comparativist. I teach in comparative politics. So here, if you look at these numbers, they are collected from a project which I'm a part of, which is called Varieties of Democracy. So I'm coding for countries there, or India in particular, right? So here we can look at the Electoral Democracy Index, where you have a lot of factors that you put together which measures the level of democracy, basically. And you can see that at the global level, you see that on the black one there, it's going down a little bit. And this is the trend I talked about earlier. If we would weigh that curve for population, it would go, the slope would be much steeper. And then you can look at Germany, you can look at South Africa, and the US. Here you can see that something's happening to India over the last few years, if we go back to 2004. So if we zoom in on India and recent developments, or developments over time here, it looks like this. This, it should say 17 here. We have data for 18, and if we could extend it to last year and this year, it would go up a bit and then down again. But the point with this illustration is that you can see that there was a crisis here before, and that was here. This is the emergency in India in 1975, which lasted until 1977. That is when Indira Gandhi suspended democratic rights and procedures in the whole country. And opposition leaders were thrown in jail. So there were various reasons for that. There's a long story behind it, so I won't go into the details, but you can see there's been a major crisis before.
Where is this data from?
Varieties of Democracy. The Varieties of Democracy project.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you take this line now then, and if you would project it downward, if it goes on like this, which it has been for a while then you will actually be here in the mid-2020s. You will actually come back to that level if things continue the way they are now. So the trend is bad. Here we look at the Liberal Component Index, and you compare it to what is called the Deliberative Component Index. Then you can see that one of the most marked trends here is deliberation. To what extent people are willing to talk to each other in political conversations and negotiate with each other without setting the agenda first on what the outcome has to be. It's a very important part of a democracy. But that type of communication has worsened, the quality of that type of conversation has worsened over time. If we look at the Freedom of Expression Index, you see the same thing. You see that there is less freedom of expression now, and it's going rapidly downwards. And this is not only because of the censorship, which you could refer to the central government. It's a type of self-censorship which is going on here, which comes into play when people are threatened if they state their opinions or say something which is critical towards the sitting regime. This is the effect that you're looking at there. But some things are working better, right? For example, there's been a lot of talk about corruption. There is less corruption now in India, right? Well, if you go back to the same data set again, you could see that there is less corruption in the higher levels of governments. There is less corruption in the higher levels of government. At the lower levels of corruption, lower levels of governance and government, there is more corruption now than before, and it seems to be increasing. But is there a Hindu Rashtra? Is there an ethnic state being built here then? Well, if we take these numbers and look at them quickly, we look at first of freedom of religion. Well, it's not necessarily something we can say that the freedoms are there, but that's when we're looking at the status for religious groups in the constitution. And then you have the freedom from political killings. Well, this is a situation which has become worse. And if you look at repression of religious organizations and repressions, well, it's not going well. And then you have religious organizational consultation. Sorry, that is this thing. Sorry. Here it is. So religious consultation is going up. But the thing is that the consultations are about the central government talking to Hindutva organizations. So they're not talking to the Muslim organizations, for example. And this is in news. There are attacks against religious minorities to a large extent now. Pew Research published this a couple of years ago, which shows that there are more social hostilities and they are related to religion in India now than before, and India is very high. They also published this result, which has to do with government restrictions on religion. Here China is, of course, performing the way it does. And you have social hostilities there. And India is very high on this one. As you can see there, you see the size of the circle is relative to the population on this scale as well, on government restrictions as well. So what is the Hindu Rashtra? What does it imply from 2014 and onwards, which is the time we have seen Modi in power? Well, we see attacks against Muslims, Christians and Dalits, attacks against secular activists and journalists, like Gauri Lankesh, for example. She was a journalist in Karnataka. She was killed 2 years ago by an organization connected to the Hindutva Movement. Attacks against NGOs, but not just any NGOs. We look at the attacks against NGOs that work with human rights issues and women's rights. And just very shortly after Modi came in power in 2014, 20,000 of the NGOs out of 30,000 lost their right to receive money from abroad. And the official reason was that they didn't keep the bookkeeping in order and things like that. But it seems like there was a targeted action against organizations that could be perceived as critical towards the Modi regime and that were working for human rights and fundamental democratic rights and for women's rights. We have seen forced conversions back then to Hinduism. We see also a civil society which is more politicized, but in a confrontational way. You see the curriculum in the schools are changing as well. And there is a culture of fear now, which I encounter when I go there and I talk to publishers, journalists, and people who would be outspoken before. They say they can't say things anymore, which they could say before. And this is a dangerous situation because I study political tolerance. And political tolerance is about to what extent do you accept that people hold views that you don't like yourself, but as long as they're not about overthrowing the democratic system, you would have to accept them because that's a part of democracy. Sometimes in Sweden, people may have the perception that democracy is about making people think the same. That you should remember is a perverted idea. That is not the point with democracy. The point of democracy is finding peaceful solutions to conflicts. And we are supposed to think different things, okay? So that's something we have to remind ourselves here a little bit about to some extent. So political tolerance is about accepting that people have different views, right? But they still have the same rights as, you know, we have universal rights, okay? And this thing is like a pillar for making democracy work. You have to have that in the heads of people. They have to understand that in order to make democracy work, right? So this is decided by a lot of individual factors, education, age, gender, and so on, but also contextual factors. The contextual factors are the things that surround us, right? The kind of country that you live in, what the regime type is there, what kind of economic growth there you have there, and so on. And here, threat is very important for the level of political tolerance that you can manage to uphold. If you feel threatened by something, political tolerance will very easily just fly out of the window, okay? Also, the regime type is important. The regime type has an impact on how you think about other people's rights. And this, I would say, is changing now in India. I'll just illustrate how things are happening in terms of how they seem to correlate. On the left axis, you have the Liberal Democracy Index, which I used before. And on this axis, I put Kashmir terrorist killings, the number of killings in Kashmir. And it was very interesting because the number of terrorist killings were going down for a while. And then things happened here after 2014, and the terrorist killings were going up again. At the same time, we've seen democracy going down. This is at the national level a repetition of the pattern that we saw at the state level in Jammu and Kashmir in the period of early 1980s until 1991 and 92, when the uprising in Kashmir started, which we see still go on in that part of the world. And this has to do with policies, of course. Modi's policies here have been quite dramatic. This is a shot I took also at the same meeting as the one from 2014. And what we saw then in August 5th, I will explain that very briefly for you. This is the northernmost part of India. Here you have Pakistan. This is the state, Jammu and Kashmir, as it has been controlled by India. The place we call Jammu Kashmir here is the area which has been controlled by India. Then you have the Azad Kashmir northern areas. That's controlled by Pakistan. Up to the right, you see the Aksai Chin and areas controlled by China. It has been divided like this since 1947, since independence, you could say. Some things have changed, but not very much. So you've had this state, Jammu and Kashmir, and they had a special place in the Indian constitution. They had more autonomy than almost all other states in India. But it was also the place which could exercise the least autonomy of all the states in India because of the conflicts between India and Pakistan. So the leaders in India were quite worried, of course, to let democracy work freely here in this particular area. But when it did, as you saw, for example, in a period between 1977 to early mid-1980s, when democracy worked well in that part called Jammu Kashmir, then you could find the lowest support for radical movements, violent separatists and such. You would see Muslims and Hindus working together across party lines during that period. But then you had a deteriorating situation in the way that the area was governed, and that created the conflict we saw later on. Of course, aided also by Pakistan, because Pakistan has a very special role here to play as well. But this is not the case anymore. On August 5th, the Article 370, which regulated the special status of Jammu and Kashmir, was made ineffective by the sitting government. So now today, you have a new situation. You have a situation where there is a Jammu and Kashmir, which is not a state anymore, it's a union territory. And the state is now divided in two parts. So you have Ladakh, which is also union territory, but without its own parliament. So you have something which is much smaller now, called Jammu and Kashmir, and they have a parliament, but it has much less power. And this was a dramatic thing, which came, it was promised by the BJP. We should have seen it coming, but for myself, I was not prepared that it was going to happen like it happened. And it was quite dramatic. This was the process as the change took place. First, the government said there were terror threats. This was early, first week in August. And this was a very sensitive period when there was a lot of people pilgrimaging to the Amarnath cave, a holy place in Jammu and Kashmir. And then everybody who was there, who didn't live there, was evacuated. Journalists were evacuated, the pilgrims were evacuated, and the few tourists there were evacuated as well. And then security forces were sent in. Political leaders were arrested and put in house arrest or regular arrest. There were curfews, and communications channels for communications were cut off. Physical channels like roads, but also, of course, Wi-Fi, internet, telephone lines, etc., were shut down. And then after that, on the Monday it was, I think, wasn't it Monday, Ashok? Yeah, it was a Monday 5th, yeah. Then the parliament made the Article 370 ineffective. First in the Lok Sabha and then the Rajya Sabha. I have Ashok here, Ashok Spain. He's a very good friend of mine, and he knows all these things much better than me. So, but we are talking about these things all the time. But in any case, so if you see me talking like this, like who am I talking to? It's Ashok. Now, how could the parliament? How could the government motivate this? How did they do this? Well, first of all, in Jammu and Kashmir, the parliament didn't have any power because Jammu and Kashmir was a rule from the center because of the conflicts going on there. So the powers had been taken away already by certain rules that you find in Indian constitution. And the argument which was made then was that, well, since there was a lot of trouble and conflicts in the parliament in Kashmir, it had been suspended, it wasn't working anymore. Kashmir was represented by the parliament in New Delhi. And the New Delhi parliament, they voted for abolishing or making ineffective Article 370. For somebody who studies democracy, that is a breach of the whole contract which democracy builds on. The whole thing with deliberation I talked about before, that was a great breach to that. And now it will be tested, of course, whether this move was constitutional and so on. But I think that nothing much, this is what has happened now, and that this decision will stand for a long time. But Article 370 hasn't been eradicated from the Constitution. It could be something that the government saves as a bargaining power. We don't know. We'll see about that. But what is this? It sounds very chaotic, right? So now I will just finish by an expose showing what happened to the political system in India, which has changed so rapidly. This is the Congress party, which was in power for so long since independence. This is the percentage of votes that they had over the years. Of course, it's gone down, but that is happening all over the world, that you don't find so many very strong parties because you have pluralism coming to life and things like that. Now, the other line is the Lok Sabha, the parliament seat, the lower house seats share. And you can see that it's going up and down. Sometimes you have many more seats in the parliament than you have votes. And that's because there is the voting system in India, which is the majoritarian system. So you will have this exaggerated representation sometimes, or underrepresentation sometimes. But here we can see the competition with the BJP in terms of percentage of votes. And from here, actually, they existed before 1984, but in different shapes. But here they started to come into play as a real political power. And they have been growing for quite a while. And it seemed to peak in 1998 with the nuclear tests and everything like that. And it was, for us, studying politics in India a little bit more closely, it looked like it was, things were going in a different direction for a while. But the big comeback starts then in 2009, and since then the BJP has been going up. And their representation, this is the representation in the Lok Sabha. Here you can see the Congress party votes in percentage and the Congress party seats share. That's in blue. And then it's the same thing for the BJP. Now you can see that the latest thing we see here is a great exaggeration of the seats in the parliament. So they haven't taken over the country, but they have become very strong. You can see these lines here that I put up here are just there to illustrate where you see bigger or smaller discrepancies. But the BJP is a very strong party now also if you just look at vote shares. It is a very strong party. And the kind of dominance they have now will give them a complete dominance over the lower house. And they seem to be perhaps on their way to see, we may see a situation within 3 or 4 years where they have the majority in the upper house as well. That is the trend. That's where it's going towards. This is India in the 50s, and then we move forward like this. And you can see the blue color is basically Congress party rule, okay? Congress party ruled the whole area. In 77, you could see the under-vegetation coming to life, other parties coming into play, and this is after the emergency. You would see a shift in power then, that the Congress was struggling a bit more than they had before, right? But then the Congress makes a comeback again. They become the most dominating force in Indian politics. And in 84, that must have been the strongest support we have ever seen almost for the Congress party. And this is after the assassination of Indira Gandhi. There was a big sympathy wave for Indira Gandhi in 84 after she was assassinated. And then things started to happen. After 84, we saw BJP reformulating a new program. And this is taking effect in the heart of India here. You can see that in the Hindi belt, you could say, that the BJP is becoming popular with the saffron colors here. Otherwise, you have the Indian National Congress in blue here. And this is how the changes have looked since. You can see that the BJP is not only a part of the Hindi belt anymore. It has become the strongest national party in India. And the only places holding out here is like Kerala and Tamil Nadu. they are still fighting a different battle here, you could say. So in the election now, they have a situation where they can completely dominate, and you also see in the Rajya Sabha that they are growing in numbers. The BJP has 80 now of a total of 245, but they're moving forward. So will it stop here? Well, of course it would be nice to be able to say that as on a final note, that these are just things that may not have such consequences. But there are so many things happening at the same time. For example, now we have a citizenship amendment bill. This is a proposal which relates to people who have fled, who have come in as illegal migrants to India, and they belong to minorities, and if they are Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, Parsi, Christians, they can get citizenship in India. That's what the bill is about, but not Muslims. And this bill was brought before the Lok Sabha in January this year, and it gained strong support. But the BJP never moved it to the upper house because they were afraid it would frighten the electorate in the northeast states. But it looks like now that this bill is coming back again in November, probably, if we listen to Amit Shah. And if they pass the bill the way it's suggested now, you will see a differentiation on how the law is constructed differently for citizens in general and as compared to the Muslim community in particular. So people say that this is a breach of the parts of the Constitution which safeguards against discrimination along religious lines. But the battle is here now in November over this. And if the bill passes the way it is designed now, then it's a sign of India becoming something we could call a Hindu Rashtra, I would say. So that's really depressing end note for a way to end the lecture, but I'm not here to make you happy or anything like that, enlighten, I hope. But this is very, very important, and because if we look at the chances for democracy, the final word then, well, I mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative in the beginning, and there India has opted out so far because India doesn't trust China, and India has border conflicts with China. And China makes claim to one of the states in northeast India, for example. So there are conflicts there which are hard to resolve. And maybe you remember, you probably don't remember, by the way, but some people remember when India carried out its nuclear tests. There was a BJP government then. And the foreign minister, George Fernandez, he said that when the nuclear tests were carried out, he said that Pakistan is not the main enemy. China is the #1 enemy. And this is the thing which we can see if you look at the space program, how it's connected to military applications and so on. India is in a conflict. India has different interests than China's. And China is about to circumvent and close in India with these avenues we call the Belt and Road Initiative. So India is becoming a quite isolated place where the pressures from around it are increasing. And then you have a situation there where pressures against minorities are increasing as well. Now, is this good or bad for India's democratic future? I don't know, but I think that if India doesn't join China on the BRI, it will need allies. It will need allies. And those allies could be the EU, the United States, for example. And in a near future, it could mean that, for example, the EU could talk about democracy, human rights, and so on when it negotiates with India. So far, both the United States and the EU are looking mainly at the economic advantages it can make by trading with India and so on. The democratic question has a very low level. It doesn't mean very much in negotiations right now, unfortunately. But there could be a future for that.